Marcus Thorne moved to this neighborhood for one reason: peace. He was a quiet man, an engineer who just wanted a place for his workshop. But from the moment he arrived, his neighbor, the head of the HOA constate, that was the getting the souse, made his life a living hell over the smallest things. A trash can out 5 minutes early, flowers that were too colorful, and, when words failed, she turned to vandalism, knocking over his trash can week after week. I'm going to tell you the incredible story of how this man, abandoned by his community, used his brilliant mind, not for revenge, but for justice. This is the story of how he built a trash can that exposed a bully and changed an entire neighborhood. Welcome to HOA Black. Part 1. The trap is sprung. The night in Willow Creek Estates was quiet. A deep, manufactured quiet, where the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of automatic sprinklers cycling on and off down the lane. It was a sound designed to soothe, a whisper of order and control. At precisely 10 o'clock, a shadow detached itself from the perfectly manicured hedges across the street. It was Brenda Miller. Clad in dark athletic wear, she moved with a practiced, almost predatory silence, her expensive walking shoes making no sound on the flawless pavement. This was her domain. She was its silent guardian. She approached the house of Arthur Jenkins. Specifically, she approached his trash can. It stood at the curb, a dark plastic sentinel, exactly where the Homeowners Association bylaws dictated it should be. For a moment, she just stared at it. A strange tightness in her chest. It was just an object. But to her, it had become a symbol of defiance. In her world of beige siding and uniform lawn heights, it was the one thing that had challenged her carefully constructed order. She looked left, down the long, empty street. Then, right, nothing but the pale, sterile glow of identical streetlights on identical, empty lawns. Satisfied, she took a steadying breath. With a quick, sharp motion born of frustration, she kicked the base of the can. She braced herself for the familiar, satisfying clatter of it tipping over, spilling its neatly bagged contents onto the pristine asphalt. It was a small act of chaos, a brief assertion of her power. But nothing happened. The can didn't move. It didn't even rock. It felt anchored, solid, like a fire hydrant. Confused, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. She stepped closer, peering down in the dim light, and that was her mistake. First, the light. It wasn't a sudden, angry flash from a typical motion detector. It was a soft, almost theatrical glow. 2 spotlights, mounted discreetly under the eaves of the house, switched on with a silent click. They bathed her, the sidewalk, and the stoic trash can in a clean, inescapable circle of white light. She froze instantly, her hand flying to her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was exposed, utterly and completely. Then, the image. A small, hidden projector, nestled inside a hollowed-out landscape rock near an azalea bush. Word to life, onto the blank canvas of Arthur's immaculate white garage door. A silent movie began to play. It was a video of her, from the previous Wednesday night, performing the exact same act, the same dark clothing, the same furtive glances, the same spiteful kick that had sent the can toppling, a ghostly, pixelated version of her own petty crime, playing on a silent, damning loop. She stared, horrified, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. But the final piece was the worst. A voice, calm, measured, recorded. It came from a small, weatherproof speaker hidden somewhere among the ferns on the front porch. It wasn't loud, but in the dead quiet of the night, it was as clear and penetrating as a siren. Willow Creek Surveillance System, the voice said, flat and utterly neutral. The behavior has been noted. Brenda, 7, has been to stop the chower of the fire. Her name. He had used her name. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. This wasn't a random security measure. This was personal. It was a message. A meticulously crafted trap designed just for her. She stumbled backward, her sense of control shattering. She tripped over the curb, catching herself before she fell. She didn't look back at the house, at the light, at her own shameful, repeating image. She just ran. Her silent escape now, a clumsy, panicked flight. The circle of light, and her own silent movie, chasing her all the way back into the comforting shadows of her own yard. The trash can remained, standing perfectly still in its circle of light, a quiet victor. It had ended here, in the dark, under a silent, digital gaze. But it began 6 months earlier, in the bright, hopeful light of a Carolina sun. It began with a promise. Arthur Jenkins, at 62 years old, had unpacked the last box. A retired architect, a man who had spent 40 years creating order from chaos on drafting tables and construction sites. He was now seeking the opposite. He wanted a gentle, pleasing lack of purpose. He wanted quiet mornings with the newspaper and long afternoons in a garden. He looked out at the bare patch of earth in the backyard. He could already picture the trellis he would build, the climbing roses he would plant for Sarah, his late wife. It was the one thing she'd always wanted. A small dream they never had time for. This neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, felt right. The houses were sturdy, well built. The lawns were a deep, reassuring green. The silence was real, a stark contrast to the city noise he had left behind. But at the community entrance, a sign stood on the lawn, green and white, professional, permanent, like a judgment, managed by the HOA. In his mailbox that first day, there was no welcome note from the neighbors. No casserole dish left on his doorstep. There was only a thick white envelope. Inside was not a letter. It was a book. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions. 112 pages of them. The rules. Arthur Jenkins respected rules. They were the foundation of everything he had ever built. So he sat at his new, empty kitchen counter, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him, and he read every single word, from lawn maintenance schedules to the approved shades of exterior paint. He saw the blueprint for a community, an orderly, predictably, and stable place to live. He did not yet see the bars of a cage. The welcome letter tucked inside the book was signed by a single, crisp signature that seemed to press into the page. Brenda Miller, chair of the Architectural Compliance Committee. And for a while, the rules seemed distant, theoretical. Life was quiet, just as he had hoped. He had unpacked a life's worth of memories into these empty rooms, photographs, books, the old rocking chair Sarah loved. And finally, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He thought he had found his home. He did not know he had just stepped onto a battlefield. Part 2, the first letter. For 3 full weeks, the silence held. It was a good, honest silence. Arthur settled into the comfortable rhythm of Willow Creek Lane. He learned that Mr. Henderson 2 doors down was a creature of habit, retrieving his newspaper from the driveway at precisely 6 a.m. every morning, rain or shine. He learned that the young family across the street had 2 small children whose excited shrieks marked the arrival of the school bus at 3:15 p.m. each afternoon. These were the small, predictable patterns of a functioning community, the very things he had been searching for. He spent his mornings in the garden, his hands deep in the rich Carolina soil, planning where the climbing roses would go, imagining how Sarah would have loved the morning glories he planted along the back fence. He even exchanged a few pleasantries with neighbors. Brief, friendly conversations over low brick walls about the unpredictable weather and the stubbornness of crabgrass. He began to feel that perhaps the thick rule book was just a formality, a worst-case scenario document for a community that, in reality, ran on simple, unspoken goodwill. The initial feeling of being an outsider began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. And then, the first letter arrived. It landed in his mailbox with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should have been. It was different from the thick welcome packet. This envelope was thinner, more rigid. His name and address were typed with a sterile, sans serif font that felt impersonal, almost accusatory. The H. O. Back to night of proof. A. Logo. An elegant rendering of a willow tree drooping over a placid creek. Sat at the top of the page like the seal of a minor but inescapable government agency. He carried it into his kitchen, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. The letter was brief, coldly formal. It was a notice of a violation. It stated that on the previous Wednesday, he had been found in non-compliance with Article 7, Section C, of the community bylaws. His trash receptacle, it informed him in stark black and white, had been placed curbside at 6:50 p.m., 10 minutes earlier than the 7 p.m. mandate. The letter did not use words like mistake or friendly reminder. It used words like violation, non-compliance, and infraction. The final sentence was not a suggestion. It was a warning. It stated that future infractions could and would result in a monetary fine. A fine. For 10 minutes of his time, it was signed again with that same crisp, authoritative signature. Brenda Miller, chair of the Architectural Compliance Committee. Arthur read it twice, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. It was absurd, utterly, bureaucratically absurd. His first instinct was a quiet amusement. He pictured a stern-faced woman with a stopwatch and a pair of binoculars, hiding in her window, waiting for the exact moment to record his transgression. He blamed himself, initially, for not rereading that particular section of the rulebook more carefully. It was an oversight on his part. As an architect, a man who lived by codes and precise measurements, he could appreciate a devotion to precision, even if it seemed excessive. So the next Wednesday, he set an alarm on his phone for 6:59 p.m. He waited inside, watching the clock. When the alarm chimed, he rolled his trash can down the driveway. He even took a steel measuring tape from his workshop, knelt on the pavement, and ensured the can was exactly 12 inches from the edge of the road, just as the technical diagram in the rulebook illustrated. He felt a small, private sense of satisfaction. Problem solved. Order restored. He would play the game. He would be the perfect neighbor. He thought that was the end of it. He had misunderstood the nature of the game. It was not a game he could win. 2 weeks later, another envelope appeared in the mailbox. It felt identical to the last one, and his quiet smile from before faded completely. He carried it inside, a familiar knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He already knew who it was from. He knew it wouldn't be good news. This one was about his front porch, specifically the 2 large terracotta pots of bright red geraniums he had placed on either side of his front door. They were a cheerful, vibrant splash of color against the home's muted brick. Sarah had loved geraniums. Their simple, honest red was her favorite color. The letter informed him that PER, the approved landscape and color palette outlined in Exhibit D of the bylaws. The color red was deemed overly vibrant and inharmonious with the community's natural, earth-toned aesthetic. He was instructed, not asked, to replace them with plants of a more suitable color. The letter helpfully suggested options: white, pale yellow, or light pink. It was a list of pale, washed-out colors, a list of surrender. The amusement was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. This wasn't about rules anymore. This wasn't about maintaining a pleasant community. This was about control. It was about one person's narrow, rigid vision being imposed upon him. That weekend, while working in his yard, he saw her for the first time in person. Brenda Miller. She was walking on the other side of the street. A small, neat woman with a clipboard clutched in her hand like a scepter. She wasn't enjoying the beautiful spring day. She was auditing it. She would stop in front of a house, make a deliberate note on her clipboard, and move on to the next. Her gaze swept over each property with a critical, praising eye, lingering for an extended moment on his porch, on the offending red flowers, Their eyes met for a brief second across the wide expanse of perfect, weed-free lawns. She gave him a tight, unsmiling nod that was more of an acknowledgement than a greeting. Then she continued on her patrol. The message was clear. She was always watching. She was the warden of Willow Creek. He stood there for a long time after she had passed, the garden hose limp in his hand, water pooling around his feet. He looked at the red geraniums, a small, living piece of his and Sarah's shared memory. Then he looked at the quiet houses around him, all painted in nearly identical shades of beige and gray, all adorned with pale, compliant flowers. He felt the weight of that 112-page book settling over him. Not as a guide, but as a cage. He complied with the rule about the flowers, replacing the vibrant red with a dull, lifeless white. He told himself it was a small price to pay for harmony. He did not yet understand that for Brenda Miller, compliance was not seen as peace. It was seen as surrender, and it only made her want more. Part 3. The Tipping Point. After Arthur replaced the red geraniums with pale white petunias, a strange quiet descended. For 2 weeks, the mailbox yielded nothing but junk mail and bills. Brenda Miller's patrols continued, but her gaze no longer lingered on his property. Arthur began to hope, cautiously, that the worst was over. Perhaps he had passed her tests. Perhaps now he would be left alone to cultivate his garden and live out his retirement in the peace he so desperately craved. It was a fragile hope, but he clung to it. Then came a Thursday morning. Trash day. He opened his front door to get the newspaper and stopped. His trash can was on its side. Its contents spilled across the end of his driveway. A single bag had torn, and coffee grounds and eggshells were scattered on the clean concrete. His first thought was an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a stray dog. Annoyed, but not alarmed, he cleaned up the mess, secured the can, and went about his day. An accident, a fluke. But the following Thursday, it happened again. The exact same scene. The can tipped over. A bag torn in the same way. This time, there was no wind. And Arthur Jenkins, a man who had built a career on identifying patterns and structural weaknesses, knew this was no longer a coincidence. This was a message. It was deliberate. His hope curdled into a cold, quiet anger. This was no longer about petty rules written on a piece of paper. This was a physical incursion, a violation of his space. He decided he needed proof, not assumptions. Proof. He didn't buy a large, obvious security camera. That would have been a declaration of war. Instead, he went online and ordered a small, discreet wildlife camera, the kind birdwatchers use. It was designed to look like a rustic, decorative birdhouse. He spent an afternoon modifying it slightly, ensuring the lens had a clear, unobstructed view of the curb. The next Wednesday evening, after placing his trash can out at 7 p.m. Yourself. Precisely. He mounted the birdhouse on the oak tree in his front yard. It looked perfectly natural, perfectly innocent. The next morning, he retrieved the memory card with a steady hand. He sat down at the desk in his study, the room where he kept his old blueprints and drafting tools. He inserted the card into his computer and clicked on the video file. The footage was grainy, filmed in the ghostly black and white of night vision, but the image was painfully clear. At 10:13 p.m., a figure walked into the frame. A woman, walking a small, fluffy white dog. It was Brenda Miller. She paused at his driveway, glanced quickly up and down the empty street. Then, with a casual, almost practiced motion, she kicked the base of his trash can. The can toppled over. She didn't even break her stride. She just continued her walk as if nothing had happened, her little dog trotting happily beside her. Arthur sat there, staring at the screen. He played it again and again. The casual cruelty of the act was what struck him most. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was an act of routine contempt. His anger cooled, replaced by a profound, heavy disappointment. This was the system he had chosen to live in. This was the person charged with upholding its integrity. He still believed in the system. He believed that with undeniable proof. The other members of the HOA board would have to act. This wasn't about a flower color anymore. This was vandalism. He composed a formal, polite email to the HOA board's general address. He explained the recurring issue. He attached the video file. He requested that they address the matter appropriately. He felt a sense of grim satisfaction as he pressed send. The truth, he believed, would prevail. 2 days passed in silence. Then, an email appeared in his inbox. It was from the HOA. It was not addressed from a person, but from the board of directors. The message was short, a masterpiece of bureaucratic detachment. Dear Mr. Jenkins. It read, "Thank you for your correspondence. The HOA does not mediate in personal disputes between residents. We encourage neighbors to resolve their differences amicably. We consider this matter closed." He said there. He read the email 3 times. He looked at the video file still open on his computer. Then he looked at the email again. Personal disputes. Resolve amicably. Matter closed. The words were a wall. A door slammed in his face. The system wasn't broken. The system was working exactly as it was designed to protect its own. In that moment, something inside Arthur Jenkins shifted. The man who respected rules, who believed in order and process, was gone. He didn't reply to the email. He didn't forward it to a lawyer. He simply moved his cursor and dragged the email into the trash folder on his computer. The silence in the room was absolute, and in that silence, a new man began to form a new blueprint. Part 4. The Architect's Blueprint. The anger didn't last. In its place, something far more potent settled in: focus. For the first time in months, Arthur Jenkins felt the familiar, clarifying hum of a problem that needed a structural solution. He was no longer a retiree trying to keep the peace. He was an architect with a design challenge. He went out to his workshop, a clean, orderly space behind the garage where every tool had its place. The scent of sawdust and machine oil felt like coming home. He pulled out a fresh sheet of drafting paper, clipped it to his old wooden drawing board, and picked up a graphite pencil. He was not designing a building. He was designing a response. His first thought was retaliation, an equally petty act, but he dismissed it immediately. To stoop to her level was to lose. He was better than that. His solution had to be elegant, it had to be intelligent, and it had to be final. His second idea was for a deterrent, a loud one, a motion-activated alarm, perhaps, or a high-powered sprinkler system that would soak her. He sketched it out for a few minutes. A siren wired to a sensor, a valve connected to a water line, but he crossed it out. Noise was a blunt instrument. It would disturb the neighbors. It would violate the very peace he was trying to protect. It was an inelegant, chaotic solution. It wasn't his style. He sat back in his chair, staring at the blank paper. What was Brenda's actual goal? It wasn't just about the trash can. It was about power. It was about her ability to act with impunity, hidden by the darkness and the silent complicity of the neighborhood. She felt invisible. She felt entitled. And that was it. The key. The problem wasn't the can being knocked over. The problem was her invisibility. The solution, therefore, wasn't to punish her. It was to remove her cover. The solution was not noise. It was light. It was truth. A new energy flowed through him. He began to sketch again, this time with speed and precision. The blueprint was simple in concept, but elegant in its execution. It would be a system of 3 parts, all working in silent concert. Part 1, the anchor. He would make the trash can immovable. He designed a heavy steel base that could be bolted into the asphalt at the edge of his driveway, hidden from view. The can would slot into it, secure and unyielding. The physical act of aggression would be rendered futile. Part 2, the spotlight. He researched and ordered 2 low-wattage but high-lumen LED spotlights. They would be mounted discreetly under the eaves of the roof, aimed at the exact spot where the trash can stood. They wouldn't be blinding. just illuminating. They would create a stage. Part 3. The mirror. This was the heart of the design. The element that elevated it from a simple security measure to a psychological masterpiece. He ordered a Pico projector, a device no bigger than his hand, and a small, weatherproof housing. He also bought a Raspberry Pi, a tiny, credit card-sized computer that he could program himself. He would connect the projector and the spotlights to the Raspberry Pi, all triggered by a single, passive infrared motion sensor hidden in a decorative landscape rock. He spent the next week in his workshop. It felt good to be working with his hands again, to be solving a tangible problem. He coded the simple program for the Raspberry Pi. He wired the components together, testing the circuits. He carefully recorded his own voice, speaking just 4 calm, neutral sentences. And most importantly, he loaded a single video file onto the computer's memory card, the night vision footage of Brenda kicking his trash can. The system was designed not to startle, but to reveal. When the sensor was tripped, the spotlights would softly fade up, the projector would turn on, displaying the video evidence on the clean, white canvas of his garage door, and the speaker would deliver its calm, recorded message. It was not an attack, it was a mirror, a quiet, undeniable reflection of her own actions. When all the components were ready, he waited for a dark, moonless night. He worked quickly and silently, installing the system. He bolted the anchor to the ground. He mounted the lights. He placed the projector rock in the garden bed. By dawn, there was no visible sign that anything had changed. The birdhouse camera was gone. The stage was set. The structure was complete. But before the performance could begin, there was one final variable to consider: the human element. Part 5. A neighbor's silence. The next morning, the sun rose on a perfectly calm and orderly Willow Creek lane. Arthur's system was in place, a silent, sleeping sentinel waiting for the cover of darkness. But as he sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee, a final flicker of doubt, or perhaps hope, surfaced within him. He had designed a response to a single person, but the problem felt larger than just Brenda Miller. The board's silence was a form of complicity. And what about the neighbors? Did they see what was happening? Did they simply not care before setting his trap? He felt he owed the community one last chance to be a community. He needed to test the silence. He saw his chance later that morning. Mr. Henderson, the retired history teacher from 2 doors down, was outside meticulously trimming the hedges that separated their properties. Henderson was a pleasant man, always quick with a friendly wave and a comment about the weather. He was, in Arthur's brief experience, the quintessential good neighbor. Arthur walked outside, carrying a glass of lemonade, and ambled over to the property line. "Morning, George," Arthur said, offering the glass. "Looks like hard work on a warm day. Then all of the are great namender when you not mentor of date." Henderson switched off his electric trimmer and gratefully accepted the drink, wiping his brow with the back of his glove. "Morning, Arthur. You can say that again. These things grow faster than the national debt." They shared a small, comfortable laugh. They talked for a few minutes about inconsequential things. The unpredictable spring pollen, the upcoming Memorial Day weekend. The conversation was easy, the kind of gentle back and forth that formed the bedrock of suburban life. Then, Arthur gently shifted the foundation. "Say, George," he began, his tone casual. "You've lived here a long time. You ever have any issues with critters getting into the trash cans around here?" Henderson's friendly expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He took a long sip of lemonade, his eyes darting towards the street, then back to his hedges. "Critters? Oh, sure. Raccoons. Mostly. They can be a real nuisance. Have to make sure your lids are on tight." He said the words, but his tone had lost its ease. It was guarded. "I see," Arthur said, pressing gently. "It's just, mine has been knocked over the last 2 weeks. Always on a Wednesday night. Seems like a very punctual raccoon. And that was one of that menu's support and dock too. And they will stayed by the Wade, The silence that followed was heavy and thick with unspoken words. Henderson set his glass down on the brick wall between them. He wouldn't meet Arthur's gaze. He busied himself picking a few stray leaves off a branch. The air, which had been filled with friendly chatter just moments before, was now charged with a palpable tension. He knew. Of course. He knew. "Arthur," Henderson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked over his shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard even on his own property. "Look, you seem like a good man, a quiet man. You've done a nice job with the place." He paused, choosing his next words with extreme care. "But Brenda, well, she's been here a very long time. She's very passionate about the rules." "I have sieged of the cone, passionate." It was a carefully chosen, diplomatic word. It was a word that meant obsessive. It meant unreasonable. It meant feared. "Thank you for watching." The simple, heartbreaking statement hung in the air between them. Henderson was not offering help. He was not offering solidarity. He was offering a warning to let it go, to not make waves. He was advising Arthur to accept the harassment as a fact of life in Willow Creek. The price of admission for living in Brenda Miller's domain. The silence of a good man, Arthur realized, was not born of malice, but of fear of becoming the next target. Arthur looked at this man, this retired teacher of history, a man who had likely spent a career teaching students about standing up for what's right, and he felt a profound sense of loneliness. Henderson was not an enemy. He was just a spectator, and in this arena, spectators were no different from an empty stadium. Arthur nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning in his eyes. He didn't say another word about the trash can. There was nothing left to say. Part 6. The Performance. That evening, as darkness settled over Willow Creek Lane, Arthur Jenkins did not sit by a window, nor did he watch a monitor displaying the feed from a hidden camera. His work, the work of the architect, was done. The structure was built. Now it simply had to perform its function. He sat in his favorite armchair in the living room, the lights off, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold on the end table beside him. He listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He was not feeling vengeful. He was not feeling triumphant. He was feeling a quiet, heavy tension, the same feeling he'd had countless times on a construction site, waiting to see if a complex design would bear the load it was intended to. He had built his response with precision. Now, he could only wait for the test. Outside, Brenda Miller began her nightly constitutional, her little white dog trotting ahead. To an observer, she was just a health-conscious resident enjoying the cool night air. But inside, her mind was churning. The new man, Arthur Jenkins, irritated her on a fundamental level. It wasn't anything he did, but what he was, an unknown, a variable she couldn't control. His quiet self-possession felt like a challenge to her authority. His initial compliance with the flower rule had satisfied her for a time, but his continued, silent resistance, symbolized by that perfectly placed trash can, felt like a mockery. She didn't hate him. She simply could not tolerate his presence. He was a flaw in the perfect, orderly world she had worked so hard to build and maintain. Knocking over his trash can was a small, satisfying way to remind him who was in charge. She turned the corner onto his street. Her steps were confident. Her routine was established. She saw the dark plastic can at the curb, a familiar silhouette against the streetlight. She approached it without hesitation. Her little dog sniffed at a nearby bush. She glanced left, then right. The street was empty. Asleep? It always was. She drew her foot back and kicked. The impact was a dull, solid thud, utterly unlike the hollow plastic rattle she was expecting. Her foot stung from the force of it. The can didn't move. It didn't even rock. For a confused second, she thought it must be frozen to the ground. She peered down, irritated, and took another step forward, into the invisible perimeter. That's when the performance began. The light came first. Not a harsh flash, but a soft, deliberate fade up, 2 spotlights from the roofline awakened, casting a perfect, clean circle of light around her. She was no longer in the shadows. She was on a stage. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her mind scrambling to understand. Then, the image. From the garden bed, the Pico projector whirred to life. On the pristine white garage door, a silent movie started to play. It was her. A week ago, the same dark clothes, the same furtive glances, the same spiteful kick. The video played on a silent, damning loop. Her own ghost acting out her secret shame for the entire empty street to see. A wave of hot, dizzying nausea washed over her. And finally, the voice. It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was calm, recorded, and terrifyingly personal. It emerged from the darkness of the porch. Willow Creek surveillance system, the neutral voice stated. The behavior has been noted. Brenda, there was no Watts, is it not Rexus? Her name. Hearing her own name spoken into the night by that disembodied voice shattered the last of her composure. This wasn't a security system. This was an accusation. It was a mirror held up to her face, reflecting a version of herself she never wanted to see. The humiliation was absolute. A physical blow. She stumbled backward. Tripping over the curb, she couldn't see past the glare of the lights. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the leash of her yapping dog, and fled. She didn't look back. She just ran. A panicked, clumsy retreat from the light, from the image, from the sound of her own name. Inside the dark house, Arthur heard the faint sound of her running footsteps fade away down the street. He didn't get up to look. He didn't feel a surge of victory. He felt a quiet finality. He closed his eyes, took a long, slow breath, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the silence of his house, not as an absence of noise, but as the presence of peace. The trap had sprung. The animal had fled in terror. But in the quiet of Willow Creek, the consequences of one sleepless night were only just beginning to seep into the light of the coming day. Part 7. The morning after. The next morning, Arthur Jenkins awoke at his usual time. The sun was filtering through his blinds, and the neighborhood was stirring with the gentle sounds of a Thursday. He made his coffee, read the first few pages of his newspaper, and followed his routine with a deliberate, calming normalcy. He felt no different, yet he knew everything was. At 7:30, he walked outside to retrieve the rest of his paper from the driveway. He paused. His trash can was standing exactly where it should be, untouched. It had been collected by the sanitation truck, and the empty can had been placed neatly back on the curb. A small, simple thing. A return to order. As he bent to pick up the paper, he saw Mr. Henderson standing by his own mailbox 2 doors down. Their eyes met. For a moment, Arthur expected Henderson to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen him, to continue the dance of avoidance from the day before. But he didn't. Instead, Henderson gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was filled with a meaning that shouted across the manicured lawns. It was a nod of understanding, a nod of respect, and perhaps a nod of slight fear. Arthur returned the nod. And that was all the communication that was needed. The entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. There were no neighbors gathering in driveways to whisper and gossip. No curious glances were thrown his way. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of complicity. It was the silence of awareness. The invisible lines of power in Willow Creek had been redrawn overnight, not with a loud declaration, but with a quiet, elegant display of light and truth. Meanwhile, inside her own perfectly ordered house, Brenda Miller was not feeling the peace of the morning. She hadn't slept. She kept seeing that ghostly image of herself projected on the garage door, hearing her name spoken by that calm, robotic voice. The humiliation had settled deep in her bone. A cold and heavy weight. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped of the anonymity that had been her shield and her weapon. She spent the morning pacing her living room, her mind racing, trying to find a way to reframe the narrative, to seize back control. She decided to go on the offensive. At 9 a.m., She picked up the phone and called Tom Peterson, the official president of the HOA. Tom was a semi-retired accountant, a man whose primary goal in life was to avoid conflict and ensure the neighborhood's property values continued to rise. "Tom, it's Brenda," she began, trying to inject a note of frantic victimhood into her voice. "Something terrible happened last night. The new man, Jenkins, he set up some kind of system. It's intimidating. Lights and voices. I was just walking my dog, and he accosted me. I feel threatened in my own neighborhood." She let her voice crack slightly on the last word. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Tom Peterson sighed. A weary, drawn-out sound. He had been expecting this call. Henderson had already called him an hour earlier, not to complain, but to nervously report a strange light show at the Jenkins house. "Brenda," Tom said, his voice flat, devoid of the sympathy she was hoping for. "Let me be clear. What exactly were you doing on his property at 10 o'clock at night?" The question caught her off guard. It wasn't the question of a concerned ally. It was the question of a weary administrator trying to assess liability. I wasn't on his property," she stammered, her story already starting to unravel. "I was on the sidewalk. My dog, he ran towards his yard. That link they were sumpide it and 24Ts. That remember. So you're saying you were on the public sidewalk when this happened?" Tom asked, his tone becoming more cautious, more lawyerly. "And what did this system actually do? Did it harm you? Did it touch you?" "Well, no. But the lights and the voice, it used my name." "Tom, it was harassment." "So it said your name," Tom repeated slowly, as if writing it down. "Brenda, Brenda, Brenda. I have to ask you directly. Have you had any prior altercations with Mr. Jenkins, for example, regarding his trash can?" The directness of the question was like a punch to the gut. The silence on her end of the line was her answer. Her carefully constructed narrative of victimhood had crumbled into dust against a few simple, direct questions. She had no power here, no clipboard, no rule book to hide behind. She was just a woman on the phone, her lies transparent and weak. She mumbled something about having to go and hung up. She sank into a chair, the phone slipping from her hand. Her authority, which had felt so absolute just 24 hours earlier, had evaporated. Power, she was beginning to understand, was not just about knowing the rules. It was about who got to tell the story, and she had just lost control of the story. Part 8. The Resignation. A full week passed in a quiet that was almost unnerving. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. Arthur Jenkins received no more letters. His mailbox held only catalogs and the occasional bill. His trash can remained upright, a silent, unassuming monument to the previous week's events. He worked in his garden, pruned his new roses, and felt the neighborhood slowly exhale around him. The invisible pressure that had permeated the air for months had finally lifted. He saw Brenda Miller's car come and go, but he never saw her. She seemed to have vanished from the public spaces of Willow Creek, her familiar patrols conspicuously absent. Then, on a Friday afternoon, an email landed in the inbox of every resident of Willow Creek Estates. The subject line was simple, professional. H. Tend to circuit tire in the 5 last to get a long over. A. Board announcement. Arthur opened it, a feeling of quiet anticipation in his chest. The email was brief, composed in the same sterile, bureaucratic language as all the others. But its message was a tectonic shift. It stated, without flourish or explanation, that Mrs. Brenda Miller had formally resigned from her position as chair of the Architectural Compliance Committee, effective immediately. The reason cited was a single, opaque phrase, for personal reasons. The email concluded by saying the board would be seeking a new volunteer for the position in the coming weeks. That was it. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a quiet, procedural removal. It was an anonymous victory, but a victory nonetheless. Arthur closed his laptop, not with a sense of triumph, but with a feeling of profound, weary relief. The war was over. Later that evening, as dusk was settling and the air grew cool, Arthur was outside watering the petunias, the white, compliant petunias that had replaced his red geraniums. He saw Brenda's car pull into her driveway across the street. She got out, her movements slow, almost heavy, and began unloading groceries from her trunk. It was the first time he had seen her up close since the night of the performance. For a moment, he considered turning away, going back inside to grant her the privacy of her defeat. But he stayed, holding the gently spraying hose, a silent witness. As she turned from her car, a bag of groceries in each arm, their eyes met across the quiet street. It was a strange, suspended moment. He saw no anger in her eyes, no defiance, no hatred. What he saw was a profound, hollowed-out exhaustion. The sharp, critical edge she always carried was gone, replaced by something brittle and lost. And underneath it all, there was a flicker of something else. Shame. A deep, undeniable shame that seemed to bow her shoulders. She held his gaze for a long second. Then, she gave a small, almost imperceptible dip of her head. It wasn't a nod of greeting. It was a nod of concession, an acknowledgement, a surrender. Without another glance, she turned and hurried into her house, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving him alone in the growing twilight. Arthur stood there for a moment longer. He slowly raised his own head in a nod. Not to her, but to the empty space where she had been. It was a gesture of acknowledgement in return. It was not forgiveness. He knew what she had done, and why. But it was not condemnation, either. He had built his response. The system had performed its function, and the matter was closed. There was no need for anything more. He turned his attention back to the flowers, the cool water making dark circles on the dry mulch. The battle was over. The aggressor had retreated. But as he stood there in the quiet of his yard, a new question began to form in his mind. Does removing a single, problematic part truly fix a flawed structure, or was the problem buried deeper, in the very foundation of the community itself? And more importantly, had Arthur Jenkins, the quiet man who only wanted peace, truly found it? Or had he simply, and unintentionally, become a new kind of symbol, a symbol of resistance that he never wanted to be? Part 9. The Unspoken Rules. The seasons turned. Summer ripened and gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. In Willow Creek Estates, the changes were subtle, but palpable. The lawns remained perfectly manicured, the houses pristine, but the atmosphere felt different. The air of constant, low-grade surveillance had dissipated, replaced by a more relaxed, neighborly quiet. The Number 5, Anyone, a board appointed a new head of the Compliance Committee, a mild-mannered retired librarian named Mrs. Gable, whose notices, when they rarely appeared, were gentle reminders rather than cold accusations. The invisible cage had been unlocked, and everyone seemed to be breathing a little more freely. Arthur Jenkins found his life changing in small, unexpected ways. He was no longer just the quiet new man at the end of the lane. He had become a respected, if unassuming, member of the community. Mr. Henderson began stopping by on his morning walks, not to offer warnings, but to genuinely ask Arthur's opinion on everything from sagging fence posts to local politics. The young family across the street started inviting him to their backyard barbecues, their children treating him like an adopted grandfather. Other neighbors, people he had only ever waved to, would now seek him out, asking for his architect's advice on a planned deck or a kitchen renovation. They came to him not because he had followed the rules, but because he had dared to establish a boundary based on reason and dignity. His quiet act of self-defense had, ironically, made him the most integrated man on the street. He dismantled his system. The spotlights were repurposed as landscape lighting for his rose garden, which was now thriving. The Pico projector and the Raspberry Pi were stored away in a box in his workshop, relics of a battle won. He left the steel anchor for the trash can in place, a silent, almost invisible reminder that peace sometimes requires a firm foundation. He occasionally saw Brenda Miller, usually from a distance, getting into her car or bringing in her mail. She never met his eye again, and he never sought hers. She was simply another neighbor now, stripped of her assumed power. A ghost in the community she once ruled. One warm October afternoon, Arthur was sitting on his front porch, reading a book, a cup of tea on the small table beside him. A car he didn't recognize slowed to a stop in front of the house for sale across the street. A young couple got out, holding hands. They were black. They stood on the sidewalk for a long time, looking at the house, then looking around at the quiet, immaculate neighborhood. The husband's gaze swept across the street and met Arthur's. He looked a little nervous, a little uncertain, the way anyone does when they are trying to see if a place could truly be a home. He saw Arthur sitting there, a quiet, older black man, reading a book on his peaceful porch. The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly. He smiled, a wide, hopeful smile, and gave a small wave. Arthur Jenkins smiled back. It was a genuine, heartfelt smile, one that reached his eyes. He raised his hand in a slow, welcoming wave. In that small, silent exchange, he understood the true nature of his victory. His meticulously designed system hadn't just protected his trash can, it hadn't just defeated a bully. It had subtly, almost invisibly, altered the structure of the community itself. It had created a small pocket of space where peace was not predicated on fearful compliance, but on mutual respect. It had made the neighborhood just a little bit safer, a little more welcoming, for the family that might come after him. The peace he had been searching for had finally arrived. It had not come in the form of quiet retreat he had originally envisioned. It had come through a quiet, intelligent assertion of his own worth. He took a sip of his tea and turned back to his book, the warm afternoon sun on his face. The house was quiet. The street was quiet. And, for the first time, it felt like home. In the end, Marcus's story isn't just about a trash can. It's a powerful reminder that the quietest forms of injustice are often the most corrosive. His solution teaches us that the best response to petty tyranny isn't matching its anger, but rising above it with intelligence, creativity, and unwavering principle. He didn't just protect his property, he rebuilt a small corner of his world on the foundation of respect. What are your thoughts on his unique brand of justice? We would be truly honored to read your perspective in the comments below. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing to HOA Black. Thank you for being our companion on this journey today.